Let me ask you a question that almost no one asks directly. What if the greatest danger to a superpower is not invasion, not war, not even political division, but the slow disappearance of its ability to make things? Not ideas, not apps, not financial instruments. Physical things. Steel, machines, electronics, infrastructure, the material foundation of power itself. Because history is brutally consistent on one point: nations that lose their manufacturing base do not remain great powers. Not eventually, not gradually. They decline permanently. And what makes this pattern so dangerous is that it does not feel like collapse while it is happening. It feels like progress. It feels like efficiency, like modernization, like moving up the value chain. This is why so many societies walk straight into it. In the first minute of this video, I want you to notice something subtle. You are not being asked to panic. You are not being asked to fear the future. You are being asked to notice a pattern so reliable that it has played out across centuries, continents, and political systems, always with the same outcome. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And once a nation enters the latest stages of this pattern, history shows there is no example of full recovery. Not one. Now here is the uncomfortable part. The United States is not watching this pattern from the outside. It is inside it. And it is already far along. To understand why this matters, we need to strip away abstraction. Manufacturing is not just one sector of the economy. It is the backbone of national capability. When a country manufactures, it develops engineers who solve real-world problems. It trains skilled workers who understand complex systems. It builds supply chains that create entire ecosystems of secondary industries. It generates middle-class jobs that do not require lifelong debt. Manufacturing is how nations translate knowledge into power. When manufacturing disappears, something deeper than jobs is lost. Capability disappears. Resilience disappears. Strategic independence disappears. And those things do not come back easily, if they come back at all. History does not reward nations that outsource their core capabilities. It makes them dependent. And dependency is not a moral category. It is a strategic one. Let's begin where this pattern first became visible at global scale. In the middle of the 19th century, one nation stood at the absolute center of the industrial world. By 1850, it produced more than half of the world's iron, more than half of its coal, and close to half of all manufactured goods on Earth. Its factories powered the global economy. Its engineers built railways on multiple continents. Its ships carried the majority of world trade. Other nations did not merely trade with it. They copied it. They bought its machines, hired its engineers, studied its methods. It was not just dominant. It was the industrial reference point for the world. And because it was so dominant, it embraced free trade. Why protect your industries when no one can compete with you? This was not arrogance. It was rational at the time. But dominance always creates imitation. And imitation, given time, creates competition. By the late 19th century, Newer industrial powers had learned the lessons well. They built newer factories, adopted more modern machinery, invested heavily in technical education, and in many cases, they improved on the original model. Steel production shifted, textile markets changed, shipbuilding moved, engineering leadership dispersed. None of this felt catastrophic at first. Market share declined slowly. Factories remained open. The nation was still wealthy. But something irreversible had begun. Once competitors matched and then exceeded its manufacturing efficiency, the original industrial leader faced a choice: modernize aggressively and accept short-term pain, or protect legacy industries and shift toward finance and services. It chose the latter. And once that choice was made, the industrial base never returned. By the middle of the 20th century, the nation that had invented the Industrial Revolution was importing manufactured goods from former imitators. 75 years later, it still has not rebuilt its industrial dominance. This was the first complete industrial collapse of a modern power. But it would not be the last. Now let's move forward and closer to home. In the middle of the 20th century, there was a city that represented the absolute peak of American industrial success. In 1950, this city had the highest per capita income in the United States. It was the undisputed capital of the global automotive industry. 3 corporations headquartered there controlled the majority of the world's car production. Hundreds of thousands of workers earned wages that allowed them to buy homes, raise families, and retire with dignity, often without a college degree. This was not a financial economy. It was a production economy. Factories did not merely create jobs, they created communities. Each factory supported toolmakers, steel suppliers, logistics firms, engineers, designers, and countless small businesses. One manufacturing job supported multiple other jobs in the local economy. This was the American middle class at its strongest. And once again, dominance bred complacency. Competitors emerged. At first, they were dismissed. Their products were smaller, cheaper, viewed as inferior. But they learned quickly. They improved manufacturing processes. They reduced defects. They prioritized efficiency and reliability. When external shocks arrived, fuel crises, changing consumer preferences, the dominant producers were slow to adapt. They assumed loyalty. They assumed permanence. They were wrong. Market share declined. Costs rose. And instead of reinvesting heavily in domestic manufacturing, companies began to cut. Factories closed. Production moved. Jobs disappeared. What followed was not just economic decline. It was social collapse. The population shrank. Tax bases eroded. Public services deteriorated. By the early 21st century, the city that had once symbolized industrial prosperity declared bankruptcy. Its factories never returned. Its skilled workforce dispersed. Its supply chains dissolved. And despite decades of revitalization efforts, the industrial ecosystem was gone. Once again, the pattern proved unforgiving. Then there is the broader region, the industrial heartland that built American power in the 20th century. For decades, this region produced the steel, machinery, chemicals, and manufactured goods that made the United States the world's leading industrial nation. Steel mills employed hundreds of thousands. Entire towns were built around factories. A high school graduate could expect stable work, good pay, and a pension. But the same forces appeared again. New competitors built newer plants, used newer technology, paid lower wages, produced at lower cost. Instead of modernizing at scale, many firms deferred investment. They sought protection. They sought cost-cutting. They sought offshoring. Trade agreements accelerated the shift. Global supply chains replaced domestic ones. Factories closed faster than communities could adapt. Between 1980 and 2010, millions of manufacturing jobs disappeared. Not replaced, disappeared. The jobs that followed paid less, offered less security, created less stability. Entire towns hollowed out. And with economic collapse came social consequences. Lower life expectancy, higher rates of addiction, population decline. These were not abstract economic indicators. They were lived realities. And once again, the industrial capacity did not return. This brings us to the present. The United States still appears wealthy. Its stock markets are strong. Its technology sector is powerful. Its financial system dominates global flows. But look beneath the surface. Manufacturing as a share of GDP has fallen dramatically since the mid-20th century. Manufacturing employment has declined even as population has grown. Critical supply chains are now external. Pharmaceutical ingredients, advanced electronics, semiconductors, industrial machinery. In moments of global stress, this dependency becomes visible. During crises, the country discovers it cannot rapidly produce what it needs. Masks, medical equipment, essential components. These are not theoretical vulnerabilities. They are structural ones. And history tells us that once a nation reaches this stage, the window for reversal is extremely narrow. In every previous case, the final stage followed. Complete deindustrialization, permanent dependency, loss of strategic autonomy. Not collapse in a dramatic sense, but decline in capability. This is the pattern. It does not announce itself. It does not ask permission. It does not reverse itself out of nostalgia. In the next part, we will break this pattern down precisely, stage by stage, and show why once a nation enters the later phases, recovery becomes nearly impossible. Not because of politics, not because of ideology, but because of structure. To understand why industrial decline becomes irreversible, we need to stop thinking in terms of politics and start thinking in terms of systems. Industrial collapse does not happen because leaders make one bad decision. It happens because a sequence of rational decisions compounds into structural failure. Every nation that deindustrialized followed nearly the same stages. Different rhetoric, different justifications, same outcome. The first stage is dominance. At this stage, manufacturing is so strong that it shapes national identity. Factories are not just workplaces, they are symbols of competence. The nation believes it knows how to make things. Wages are high, productivity is strong. Exports are competitive. This creates confidence, and confidence slowly turns into assumption. The assumption that manufacturing leadership is permanent. This is where the danger begins. In the United States, this stage peaked in the decades after World War II. By the early 1950s, the US produced roughly half of the world's manufactured goods. No other industrial power came close. American factories were intact. Competitors' factories were destroyed. The workforce was young, skilled, and expanding. Manufacturing jobs provided upward mobility without requiring elite education. This was not just economic strength, it was civilizational confidence. The second stage is imitation. Other nations study the dominant power. They copy its machines, reverse engineer its processes, train engineers using its textbooks. At first, this is welcomed. Exports rise, foreign markets grow, global influence expands. The dominant power benefits. But imitation never stops at copying. It evolves. Competitors build newer factories, adopt newer machinery, avoid legacy costs. They are not constrained by existing infrastructure or labor agreements. This is where the advantage begins to narrow. In the US case, this became visible by the 1960s and 1970s. Foreign producers began offering comparable products at lower cost. Quality gaps narrowed. In some industries, they disappeared. Still, nothing felt urgent. The third stage is rationalization. This is the most misunderstood phase. Faced with rising competition, firms seek efficiency. They cut costs. They outsource components. They move labor-intensive processes abroad. Each decision makes sense in isolation. Shareholders are satisfied. Consumers enjoy lower prices. Policymakers celebrate free trade and specialization. The narrative shifts. Manufacturing is reframed as low value. Services and finance are described as the future. Making things is treated as something advanced economies no longer need to do. This narrative is extremely seductive. It flatters elites. It justifies short-term gains. It masks long-term loss. But manufacturing is not just about final assembly. It is about ecosystems. When parts production leaves, tooling follows. When tooling leaves, engineering follows. When engineering leaves, innovation follows. Once that chain breaks, rebuilding it is extraordinarily difficult. This is where the US crossed a critical threshold. By the late 20th century, entire supply chains had moved offshore. Not just factories, knowledge. The fourth stage is hollowing out. Manufacturing still exists, but its depth is gone. Output may remain high due to automation. Profits may remain strong. Stock prices may rise, but employment collapses. Skills decay. Communities erode. This creates a dangerous illusion. Because the economy appears healthy at the top. GDP grows. Financial markets boom. Technology companies thrive. But beneath the surface, resilience is disappearing. Regions that once produced real goods become dependent on transfers. Local economies lose their anchors. Social stability weakens. This stage is visible in the American industrial heartland. Between 1979 and 2010, the US lost millions of manufacturing jobs. Entire towns lost their economic purpose. This was not just economic change, it was social trauma. The fifth stage is dependency. At this point, the nation can no longer rapidly produce critical goods. It relies on external suppliers for advanced electronics, pharmaceutical inputs, industrial machinery. Strategic materials. In normal times, This dependency is invisible. Global trade flows smoothly. Markets provide. In moments of crisis, it becomes obvious. During global disruptions, shortages appear. Production cannot ramp quickly. Strategic autonomy is revealed to be limited. This stage marks the loss of industrial sovereignty. And here is the historical constant. No nation that reached this stage ever fully reversed it. Not one. Some stabilized, some mitigated damage. But none restored their former industrial depth. The reason is simple. Industrial ecosystems take generations to build and years to destroy. Once skilled labor disperses, it does not easily return. Once supply chains relocate, they do not easily reverse. Once capital flows adapt, they resist change. This is why deindustrialization is not symmetrical. Decline is fast, rebuilding is slow, and often politically impossible. Because rebuilding requires lower short-term profits, higher capital investment, higher prices, long time horizons. Modern political and financial systems are not designed for this. They reward quarterly results. They punish patience. This creates a trap. By the time the need for reindustrialization becomes obvious, the tools to achieve it no longer exist. The sixth stage is normalization. This is where decline becomes accepted. Communities adjust downward. Expectations shrink. Policy focuses on managing consequences rather than reversing causes. The narrative shifts again. Job loss is framed as inevitable. Dependency is framed as efficiency. Vulnerability is reframed as interdependence. At this point, the system stabilizes at a lower level. Not collapse, but diminished capability. History shows that nations can remain wealthy in this stage for a time, but they no longer shape outcomes. They react. This is the final danger. Industrial collapse does not always produce immediate poverty. It produces long-term strategic weakness. And that weakness eventually expresses itself economically, politically, and socially. In the next part, we will confront the hardest question. Why, despite knowing this pattern, nations still follow it? Why intelligent societies repeat the same sequence? And why reversing it becomes exponentially harder with each passing year? If the industrial collapse pattern is so consistent, a reasonable question emerges. Why do intelligent societies keep repeating it? Why do nations with world-class universities, advanced technology, and deep historical knowledge still follow the same trajectory? The answer is uncomfortable, because industrial decline is not driven primarily by ignorance. It is driven by incentives. And incentives shape behavior far more reliably than awareness. The first force is psychological. Industrial strength creates identity. When a nation has built its prosperity through making things, that capability becomes invisible. It is assumed rather than protected. Factories become background. Supply chains become taken for granted. Skills become generational habits rather than strategic assets. This is when complacency enters, not laziness. Complacency is confidence without vigilance. In the United States, post-war industrial dominance was so overwhelming that manufacturing came to feel permanent. Entire generations grew up assuming that the ability to produce at scale was simply part of the national landscape, like geography, like climate, something that could not disappear. This assumption quietly shaped policy, education, and investment decisions. When early warnings appeared, they were interpreted through this lens. Job losses were framed as temporary. Plant closures were seen as isolated. Trade deficits were treated as accounting curiosities, because the underlying belief remained intact. We still know how to make things. History shows this belief often persists long after it becomes false. The second force is financialization. This is where the pattern accelerates. Manufacturing produces steady returns over long periods. It requires capital investment. It demands patience. It rewards continuity. Finance rewards something else entirely: liquidity, flexibility, speed. When financial returns outpace industrial returns, capital flows shift. This is not ideological. It is mechanical. In the United States, beginning in the late 20th century, financial assets increasingly delivered higher short-term returns than physical production. Stock buybacks outperformed factory upgrades. Financial engineering outperformed process engineering. Debt-fueled expansion outperformed capital-intensive modernization. From a narrow perspective, these choices were rational. From a systemic perspective, they were corrosive. Capital stopped building capacity. It began extracting value. This distinction matters. An economy that extracts more than it reinvests will eventually hollow out, regardless of how innovative its financial sector appears. History shows that once finance dominates industry, manufacturing becomes subordinate. Not strategically guided, but cost minimized. Factories are no longer treated as national assets. They become line items, easily moved, easily closed. The third force is political time horizons. Industrial policy requires decades. Political systems operate in years. Elections reward visible wins. Industrial investment produces delayed results. This creates a structural mismatch. Leaders face pressure to deliver immediate growth, low prices, and rising asset values. Reindustrialization delivers none of these quickly. It raises costs. It demands subsidies. It requires long-term coordination. As a result, even leaders who understand the danger defer action. They promise future plans, commission studies, announce initiatives, but avoid the deep structural changes required. History is filled with reports warning of industrial decline. What is rare is sustained execution. The fourth force is narrative. Narratives do not just describe reality, they shape it. Once the idea takes hold that advanced economies no longer need manufacturing, policy follows. Education systems prioritize abstract skills. Cultural prestige shifts toward finance and technology. Industrial work is framed as outdated. This narrative is particularly powerful because it contains a partial truth. Services and technology are important. Innovation matters. But the narrative becomes destructive when it implies substitution rather than complementarity. Manufacturing is not replaced by ideas. Ideas require factories to become power. Without production, innovation diffuses outward. Other nations manufacture the future. The originator consumes it. History shows that nations which stop making things do not stop needing them. They simply become buyers rather than producers. The fifth force is global dependency masking vulnerability. In stable times, global supply chains feel efficient. Components arrive just in time, costs are minimized, inventories are lean. This efficiency creates the illusion of resilience. But efficiency and resilience are opposites. Resilience requires redundancy. Efficiency eliminates it. When global systems are stressed, dependency is revealed. Production cannot ramp quickly. Alternatives are limited. Strategic choices narrow. This reality became visible during recent global disruptions. Shortages were not caused by lack of money or demand. They were caused by lack of capacity. The capacity had been optimized away. Once this happens, recovery is slow. Because capacity is not stored, it must be rebuilt. The sixth force is institutional fragmentation. Manufacturing ecosystems require coordination, education, training, infrastructure, finance, regulation. When these systems operate independently, the ecosystem weakens. In the US, responsibility for industrial health is dispersed. No single institution is accountable for maintaining productive capacity. This diffusion creates paralysis. Everyone recognizes the problem. No one owns it. History shows that successful industrial powers maintained alignment between institutions. When that alignment breaks, decline accelerates. The final force is normalization. This is the most dangerous stage. Communities adapt to loss. Expectations shrink. Decline becomes background noise. What once felt unacceptable becomes normal. Lower wages, precarious work, regional inequality. These conditions do not spark immediate revolt. They erode ambition. Over time, societies forget what full industrial strength felt like. At that point, rebuilding becomes not just economically difficult, but culturally alien. This is why industrial collapse rarely triggers decisive response. It is gradual enough to be endured, severe enough to be irreversible. Understanding these forces reveals a hard truth. Industrial decline is not caused by one policy or one party. It is the emergent result of incentives aligned against long-term capacity. Reversing it requires changing those incentives, not rhetorically, structurally. In the final part, we will confront what remains possible, what history suggests about late-stage recovery, what can be mitigated, what cannot, and how individuals, institutions, and societies should think clearly when facing a pattern that history rarely allows to be fully reversed. At the end of every long historical pattern, there is a moment of reckoning. Not a dramatic collapse, not an explosion, not a single event that can be dated and remembered, but a quiet realization. The realization that a society has crossed from choice into consequence. Industrial collapse does not arrive as punishment. It arrives as arithmetic, as the accumulated result of incentives, delays, and assumptions finally resolving into reality. History does not judge intentions. It measures outcomes. And the outcome of sustained deindustrialization is always the same: loss of strategic autonomy, loss of middle-class stability, loss of long-term national leverage, not immediately, but permanently. The most unsettling lesson of history is not that great nations decline. It is that they almost always decline while believing they still have time. Time to reform, time to adjust, time to modernize later. That belief is understandable. It is also historically fatal. Every society that successfully preserved industrial capacity did so early, before decline became normalized, before skills dispersed, before supply chains dissolved, before expectations adjusted downward. Once normalization sets in, recovery becomes extraordinarily rare. This does not mean societies collapse into ruin. It means they settle into a lower ceiling. They remain wealthy enough to function, innovative enough to adapt, but no longer capable of shaping the global system on their own terms. They react rather than lead. They absorb rather than create. They negotiate from dependency rather than strength. This is the quiet ending of industrial power, and it is far more common than dramatic collapse. The United States now stands at a historically familiar crossroads, not because it lacks intelligence, not because it lacks capital, not because it lacks innovation, but because its productive foundation has been steadily thinned. For decades, the nation has relied on the assumption that capability can always be purchased when needed, that markets will provide, that allies will supply, that efficiency will compensate for dependency. History offers no example where this assumption held indefinitely. In every case, reliance replaced resilience, and resilience, once lost, is expensive to regain. This is not a prediction. It is an observation. History does not tell us what will happen. It tells us what tends to happen under certain conditions. And the conditions that preceded industrial decline elsewhere are now clearly visible. The critical question is no longer whether the pattern exists. It does. The question is whether recognition arrives early enough to matter. Recognition does not guarantee reversal, but denial guarantees continuation. The purpose of this analysis is not despair. It is precision. To strip away comforting narratives and examine structure. To understand that industrial capacity is not nostalgic. It is not about the past. It is about optionality in the future. A society that can produce retains freedom of action. A society that cannot becomes constrained by external decisions. This distinction becomes decisive during crisis. And history assures us that crises always arrive. What remains within human control is preparation. Preparation is not panic. It is alignment. Alignment between education and production, between finance and long-term investment, between policy and physical reality. History suggests that late-stage recovery is difficult, but mitigation is possible. Not through slogans, not through short-term incentives, not through symbolic gestures, but through sustained seriousness, through institutions willing to invest beyond election cycles, through capital willing to accept slower returns in exchange for durability, through a culture that understands that making things is not beneath an advanced society. It is what makes it advanced. These shifts do not happen overnight. They require attention. And attention is a scarce resource. It competes with distraction, with outrage, with comfort. Which brings us, finally, to you, not as a voter, not as a consumer, but as a participant in public understanding. History is shaped not only by leaders, it is shaped by what societies choose to take seriously. Ideas like this survive only if they are engaged thoughtfully, not reacted to impulsively, not reduced to slogans, but discussed, questioned, expanded. If this exploration has added clarity rather than noise, the most meaningful response is not agreement. It is continuation, a measured comment that reflects thought, a question that deepens the discussion, a perspective that challenges or refines the argument. That is how serious ideas stay alive. And if there is someone you trust, someone capable of thinking beyond headlines and tribal certainty, this is precisely the kind of conversation worth sharing. Not to convince, but to explore together. Because industrial collapse is not a spectacle, it is a process. And processes can only be confronted by people willing to observe them honestly. If work like this matters to you, work that prioritizes structure over outrage, depth over speed, then staying connected matters. Not out of loyalty, but out of shared seriousness. History does not reward those who look away. It rewards those who pay attention early enough to still have choices.